Hi, I'm Annalise Clark. I work at Bella Vista Share. I am an occupational therapist and a foundation phase teacher, and I have a special interest in dyslexia and other neurodevelopmental disorders. So today I'm going to talk to you about some neurodevelopmental disorders or differences that we often see in our practice and classroom. These are the kids that come in with one known diagnosis, but once you get to know them, you start noticing that they present with more than just that one set of diagnostic behaviors. So for example, a child with dyslexia may present with their typical dyslexic behaviors, which would be difficulties in reading and spelling. But you may also notice that they really struggle to concentrate, or that they have difficulty with motor coordination or impulsivity. And so we're going to look into why this is and which neurodevelopmental difficulties typically co-occur. So before we start, I'd just like to clarify the concept of neurodevelopmental disorders. There are various types of neurological disorders that the literature refers to, and it can get quite confusing. So there are disorders that are often visible to the eyes, such as cerebral palsy, and some syndromes with a known distinct cause, which is usually genetic or acquired. For example, fetal alcohol syndrome is acquired because of in utero exposure to alcohol. Then there are neurodevelopmental disorders where the actual cause is unknown or quite complex. And this is the group of diagnoses we will be looking at today. So it's your ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, specific language impairments, and then all the disorders. So developmental dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, dyspraxia. These disorders are all identified or defined by a group or cluster of behaviors that are observed, and not in terms of their cause. So they tend to run in families and almost always occur more in boys than in girls. All right, so the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, give us a clear definition of neurodevelopmental disorders. It defines it as neurodevelopmental disorders are a group of conditions with onset in the developmental period. The disorders typically manifest early in development, often before the child enters grade school, and are characterized by developmental deficits that produce impairments of personal, social, academic, or occupational functioning. The neurodevelopmental disorders frequently co-occur. For example, individuals with autism spectrum disorder often have intellectual disability, and many children with attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, also have specific learning disorders. So it is this phenomena of co-occurrence that we'll be looking into today. The DSM-5's classification of neurodevelopmental disorders are quite big, so I'll only be talking about some of the more prevalent diagnoses. I don't particularly like using the term disorder, and you'll notice that I often refer to these as differences, and I use these two terms interchangeably. This is because the word disorder can often have a negative connotation or present as a negative label, which can affect a person's emotional well-being and self-esteem. We should really embrace the concept of neurodiversity, and the growing research into neuroplasticity shows us that the brain has the ability to adapt, recreate, and develop new pathways to learn information and skills. So yes, I use the term disorder with caution, but I do also realize that it is a clinical term and that it is used to make diagnoses. Okay, so here's a simple diagram that shows some of the conditions in the DSM-5 under neurodevelopmental disorders, just so that you can get a picture of how these are classified. There are quite a few more under some of the subheadings, but these are the ones we will look at today. So you'll see that neurodevelopmental disorders are classified into main headings. There actually are 6. The one that I didn't list here is intellectual disabilities. And then each group can have smaller subheadings or conditions. We'll be looking first at specific learning disorders, of which we will cover dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia briefly. And then we'll move on to motor disorders, where we will only cover developmental coordination disorder, which is also known as dyspraxia. And then we'll move on to communication disorders and look at a term called specific language impairment, and then finally look at the two main headings of ADHD and autistic spectrum disorder. So we often look at these different developmental disorders as each being unique, and we view them each in isolation. The literature and research, however, is now starting to prove otherwise, and that we cannot in fact view each neurodevelopmental disorder in isolation, but that we need to look at each child's behavior inclusive of other potential differences. In their book called Developmental Disorders of Language, Learning and Cognition, Hillman and Snowling write the following, and I quote, "There is no doubt that comorbidity between seemingly related disorders is rife. For example, children with mathematics disorders are likely to also have reading disorders. Children with specific language impairment are also likely to have developmental coordination disorders. And children with ADHD are likely to have a range of other disorders, including reading disorders." So let's start with the group of specific learning disorders. If we look at our classification again, we can see that specific diagnoses like dyslexia, dyscalculia, and dysgraphia falls within this category of specific learning disorders. And that all falls under the larger umbrella of neurodevelopmental disorders.